is 461 BCE. A young aristocrat stands before the Athenian assembly, surrounded by thousands of citizens who have gathered on a rocky hill beneath the shadow of the Acropolis. His name is Pericles, and he's about to propose something that will scandalize the elite and transform human civilization forever. He wants to pay poor citizens to participate in democracy. He wants to strip power from the wealthy few and hand it to the masses. He wants to turn Athens from a modest city-state into the cultural and intellectual capital of the ancient world. This is the story of how one man's radical experiment in people power created the blueprint for modern civilization, and how his own creation consumed him. Pericles was born around 495 BCE into a world of blood and privilege. His father, Xanthippus, was a war hero who had commanded Athenian forces at the Battle of Mycale, helping to destroy Persian naval power once and for all. His mother, Agariste, came from the legendary Alcmaeonid family, one of the most powerful aristocratic clans in Athens, with a lineage that stretched back generations and included reformers, tyrants, and curse-bearers. The Alcmaeonids were controversial. Centuries earlier, they had been cursed for slaughtering suppliants who had taken refuge at an altar, a crime so heinous that the gods themselves were said to have marked the family. Yet they were also reformers. Pericles' great-great-uncle Cleisthenes had been the architect of Athenian democracy itself, creating the system of tribal divisions and the Council of 500 that gave ordinary citizens unprecedented political power. So from birth, Pericles inherited a contradiction. He was born into the aristocracy, but his family legacy was one of empowering the people. This tension would define his entire life. As a boy, Pericles grew up in a city still rebuilding from catastrophe. Just a few years before his birth, the Persians had invaded Greece, destroyed Athens, and burned the sacred temples on the Acropolis to the ground. The Greeks had won, miraculously, impossibly, but the scars remained. The ruins on the sacred hill stood as a reminder of Athens' vulnerability and the price of freedom. Pericles received the finest education available. He studied music with Damon, who taught him that rhythm and harmony weren't just aesthetic choices, but tools of psychological and political influence. He studied philosophy with Anaxagoras, a brilliant but controversial thinker from Ionia, who taught that the universe was governed by natural laws rather than the whims of gods, a dangerous idea that would later get him charged with impiety. But perhaps Pericles' most important teacher wasn't a person at all. It was the assembly. In Athens, any male citizen over the age of 18 could attend the assembly, the ecclesia, which met on a rocky hill called the Pnyx about 40 times a year. Here, surrounded by thousands of fellow citizens, Athenians debated and voted on everything: war and peace, taxes and public works, honors and punishments. There was no parliament, no congress, no representatives. This was direct democracy in its purest, most chaotic form. So the young Pericles would have watched as speakers climbed onto the bema, the speaker's platform, and tried to sway the crowd. He would have seen how the best speakers combined logical arguments with emotional appeals, how they controlled their voices and gestures, how they anticipated objections and turned their opponent's words against them. He learned that in democracy, power belonged not to the strongest or the richest, but to the most persuasive. And Pericles had a problem. He wasn't naturally persuasive. Ancient sources tell us that Pericles had a deformed skull, elongated and misshaped, which earned him the cruel nickname Squillhead, after an onion-shaped sea creature. He was so self-conscious about it that he's almost always depicted in sculpture wearing a helmet. As a young man, he was apparently awkward and reserved, lacking the natural charisma that many politicians possessed. But he had something else: discipline, intelligence, and an almost superhuman focus. While other aristocrats spent their time drinking at symposia and chasing boys, Pericles devoted himself to mastering the art of rhetoric. He practiced his speeches obsessively. He studied every detail of law and precedent. He learned to project his voice without shouting, to use silence for emphasis, to craft arguments that seemed inevitable. And by his early 30s, Pericles had transformed himself into one of the most formidable speakers in Athens. And he was ready to use that power to betray his entire social class. The year 462 BCE marks the true beginning of Pericles' political career, and it began with an act of spectacular opportunism and cunning. Athens at this time was controlled by the Areopagus, an aristocratic council composed of former archons, chief magistrates, who served for life. The Areopagus held enormous power. They could veto legislation, try criminal cases, and effectively block any reforms they didn't like. They were the conservative brake on Athenian democracy, ensuring that real power remained in the hands of the old families. The leader of the conservative faction was Cimon, a war hero, immensely wealthy, and so popular that he seemed untouchable. Cimon believed in cooperation with Sparta and a foreign policy focused on fighting Persia. He represented everything Pericles opposed: aristocratic dominance, military adventurism, and the idea that politics was the business of gentlemen, not commoners. But in 462 BCE, Cimon made a critical mistake. He convinced Athens to send troops to help Sparta put down a helot, or slave, revolt. It was a controversial decision. Many Athenians distrusted Sparta, but Cimon's prestige carried the day. He personally led 4,000 hoplites to aid Athens' rival city. Then, Sparta insulted them. Distrusting the Athenians' revolutionary ideas, the Spartans dismissed the Athenian forces and sent them home without using them. It was a humiliation that Cimon couldn't survive politically. Pericles struck immediately. He allied himself with Ephialtes, a democratic reformer, and together they launched a coordinated attack on the Areopagus. They accused individual council members of corruption and malfeasance, bringing them to trial one by one. They gave fiery speeches denouncing the Areopagus as an anti-democratic institution that had no place in a free city. Within months, they had won. The assembly voted to strip the Areopagus of nearly all its powers, reducing it to a mere ceremonial body that handled only religious matters and certain murder trials. Real power now rested entirely with the assembly and the democratic law courts. It was a revolution accomplished through legal means, but a revolution nonetheless. For the first time in Athenian history, the aristocracy had been definitively defeated. The people were supreme. Ephialtes didn't live to see the full consequences of his reforms. Within a year, he was assassinated, likely by conservative opponents, though the killer was never found. Pericles, however, survived, and with Ephialtes dead and Cimon in exile, Pericles had ostracized him for his Spartan sympathies. Pericles found himself the undisputed leader of democratic Athens. But he wasn't satisfied with just political reform. Pericles understood something profound. Democracy couldn't function if only the wealthy had time to participate. If you were a poor farmer or craftsman, you couldn't afford to spend days in the assembly or serving on juries. You had to work to feed your family. Democracy, in practice, would remain an aristocratic system unless something changed. So Pericles proposed something radical:
pay citizens for public service. The proposal was explosive. Conservatives were outraged. They accused Pericles of bribing the people with their own money, of turning citizens into lazy dependents, of corrupting the civic virtue that had made Athens great. One opponent, Thucydides, not the historian, but a different political rival, organized the aristocratic opposition and fought Pericles tooth and nail for years. But Pericles won. He convinced the assembly to institute pay for jury service, 2 obols per day initially, later raised to 3. It wasn't much, barely enough for basic food, but it was enough to make participation possible for ordinary citizens. Later, he extended payment to members of the Council of 500 and to those attending the assembly itself. The effects were immediate and profound. Poor citizens flooded into the law courts and the assembly. The jury panels, which had been dominated by wealthy retirees with time to spare, now included farmers, craftsmen, sailors, and laborers. The political conversation expanded. New voices, new perspectives, new interests entered Athenian politics. Pericles had done something no one thought possible. He had made democracy truly democratic. For nearly 30 years, from roughly 461 BCE until his death in 429 BCE, Pericles dominated Athenian politics more completely than any individual before or since. He was elected strategos, general, 15 years in a row, an unprecedented streak that effectively made Athens leader without giving him a formal title or dictatorial powers. How did he maintain his power for so long? Not through force or intimidation, but through a combination of political genius, strategic vision, and the careful cultivation of Athens' greatness. First, Pericles understood that democracy needed to be spectacular. It needed monuments, festivals, and public spaces that made citizens proud to be Athenian. So he launched the most ambitious building program the ancient world had ever seen. The centerpiece was the Parthenon, the massive temple to Athena that would crown the Acropolis and announce Athens' greatness to the world. Pericles didn't just want a temple. He wanted a masterpiece that would stand for eternity. He commissioned Phidias, the greatest sculptor of the age, to oversee the project. The building would be constructed entirely of gleaming Pentelic marble. It would be adorned with the most sophisticated sculptures ever created, depicting gods and heroes in breathtaking detail. Inside would stand a colossal statue of Athena, 40 feet tall, covered in gold and ivory. The costs were staggering. The Parthenon alone required the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars in modern terms. Critics accused Pericles of wasting public money on vanity projects, of dressing Athens up like a prostitute with expensive jewelry. Pericles' response was brilliant. He stood before the assembly and offered to pay for everything himself, from his own fortune. But, he said, if he did so, he would have all the dedications inscribed with his name alone, not the city's. The message was clear. These monuments belonged to the people, not to any individual. They were investments in Athens' collective glory. The assembly voted to continue public funding. The Parthenon rose. So did the Propylaea, the monumental gateway to the Acropolis, the Temple of Nike, the Odeon, a massive concert hall, and dozens of other structures. Athens transformed from a modest city into a visual marvel that attracted visitors from across the Mediterranean. But Pericles' vision wasn't just architectural. He wanted Athens to become the intellectual and cultural capital of the Greek world. He invited the greatest minds to Athens, philosophers like Protagoras and Anaxagoras, playwrights like Sophocles and Euripides, historians like Herodotus. He established festivals and dramatic competitions that showcased Athenian tragedy and comedy. He created an environment where ideas could flourish and be challenged. The results speak for themselves. During Pericles' lifetime, Athens produced an astonishing concentration of genius. Sophocles wrote tragedies like Antigone and Oedipus Rex that explored the deepest questions of human existence, fate, and morality. Euripides pushed boundaries with plays like Medea and the Trojan Women that questioned traditional values and sympathized with society's outcasts. Aristophanes created biting political satires, including one, the Acharnians, that mocked Pericles' war policies, even while Athens was fighting for survival. Herodotus pioneered the writing of history, investigating the causes of the Persian wars and collecting stories from across the known world. Socrates began asking uncomfortable questions in the Agora, challenging Athenians to examine their beliefs and define their virtues. Pericles himself delivered speeches that were so powerful they became legendary. The most famous was his funeral oration in 431 BCE, delivered for the Athenian soldiers who had died in the first year of the Peloponnesian War. The speech, recorded and likely embellished by the historian Thucydides, is one of the most moving defenses of democracy ever written. Quote, "Our Constitution does not copy the laws of neighboring states. We are rather a pattern to others than imitators ourselves. Its administration favors the many instead of the few. This is why it is called a democracy. The freedom which we enjoy in our government extends also to our ordinary life. But all this ease in our private relations does not make us lawless as citizens. We cultivate refinement without extravagance and knowledge without effeminacy. Wealth we employ more for use than for show, and place the real disgrace of poverty not in owning to the fact, but in declining to struggle against it."
It was a vision of Athens as exceptional, not because of military might or ancient glory, but because of its values, its culture, and its commitment to human potential. Pericles was selling Athenians on themselves, making them believe they were part of something historically unique and worth defending at any cost. But there was another source of Pericles' power: empire. Athens controlled the Delian League, an alliance of Greek city-states originally formed to defend against Persia. Over time, Pericles transformed it into an Athenian empire. The contributions of allied cities became tribute payments. The League treasury was moved from the island of Delos to Athens itself. Any city that tried to leave was crushed with overwhelming force. The empire made Athens wealthy beyond imagination. Tribute flowed in, 600 talents of silver per year, equivalent to hundreds of millions of dollars. This money funded the building projects, the festivals, the payment for public service, and the powerful navy that kept the empire intact. Pericles justified it with cold realism. In a speech to the assembly, Thucydides reports him saying, "Your empire is now like a tyranny. It may have been wrong to take it, but it is certainly dangerous to let it go." Athens had become what it had once fought against, an imperial power extracting wealth from weaker states. But for ordinary Athenians, the benefits were undeniable. They lived in the most beautiful city in Greece, enjoyed cultural festivals funded by tribute, received payment for participating in democracy, and felt the pride of belonging to a great power. This was Pericles' bargain:
democracy at home, empire abroad. And for a while, it seemed to work. Pericles' private life was as controversial as his politics. Around 445 BCE, he divorced his wife and arranged marriage to a relative and began living with Aspasia, a woman who would become one of the most fascinating and scandalous figures in Athenian history. Aspasia was from Miletus, which made her a foreigner, a metic, with limited legal rights in Athens. She was brilliant, educated, and allegedly ran a kind of salon or school where she taught rhetoric. Rumors swirled that she had been a hetera, a courtesan, though these may have been politically motivated slander. What's certain is that she was Pericles' intellectual equal and possibly his political advisor. The relationship shocked Athenian society. A woman, especially a foreign woman, exercising influence over the city's most powerful man was seen as improper, even dangerous. Comic playwrights mocked Pericles mercilessly, calling him Zeus and Aspasia Hera, suggesting she controlled him like the mythical queen of the gods controlled her husband. They accused her of writing his speeches, of manipulating policy, even of causing wars. The attacks weren't just comedy. Pericles' enemies brought Aspasia to trial on charges of impiety and corrupting Athenian women. According to ancient sources, Pericles personally appeared in court to defend her, and, in a rare display of emotion from this usually controlled man, he wept before the jury, begging them to acquit her. They did, but the incident showed how personal attacks could become political weapons in democratic Athens. Pericles also faced scrutiny over his relationship with Anaxagoras, his old philosophy teacher. When enemies couldn't attack Pericles directly, they went after his friends. Anaxagoras was charged with impiety for teaching that the sun was a hot stone and the moon reflected light, rather than being divine beings. He was convicted and forced to flee Athens. Phidias, the sculptor of the Parthenon, was also accused of embezzlement and impiety, allegedly for carving his own face and Pericles' into the shield of the Athena statue. He died in prison or in exile. These attacks reveal something important. Even at the height of his power, Pericles was vulnerable. Democracy meant that anyone could be brought down through legal prosecution, ostracism, or simply losing the assembly's support. Pericles maintained his position not through institutional power, but through constant persuasion, political maneuvering, and the delivery of results. And for years, he delivered. Athens prospered. The empire expanded. The building projects neared completion. Trade flourished. The festivals grew grander. Pericles' annual election as strategos seemed almost automatic. But storm clouds were gathering. Athens' power threatened Sparta, the dominant military power of Greece. The two cities represented opposite visions of Greek life. Athens democratic, naval, commercial, imperial, and culturally innovative. Sparta oligarchic, land-based, agricultural, isolationist, and culturally conservative. Conflict seemed inevitable, and when it came, it would destroy everything Pericles had built.
The origins of the Peloponnesian War are complex and disputed, but one thing is clear. Pericles was willing to fight rather than compromise Athens' imperial power. In 433 BCE, Athens allied with Corcyra, modern Corfu, against Corinth, a Spartan ally. The next year, Athens besieged Potidaea, another Corinthian ally. Then Pericles convinced the assembly to pass the Megarian decree, banning the city of Megara from using Athenian ports and markets, effectively an economic blockade that threatened to starve Megara into submission. Sparta demanded Athens revoke the decree and respect the autonomy of Greek cities. Pericles refused. He told the assembly that yielding on this small point would be seen as weakness and invite further demands. Better to fight now from a position of strength than to retreat and fight later from a position of weakness. It was a calculated gamble based on a clear strategy.
Pericles understood Athens' strengths and weaknesses. Athens had the superior navy and vast financial reserves from the empire. Sparta had the superior army, but limited money and no capacity for a long siege. Therefore, Pericles proposed what seemed like madness: abandon the Athenian countryside, bring everyone inside the city walls, and refuse to fight a land battle. Athens had recently completed the Long Walls, fortifications connecting the city to its port at Piraeus, creating a secure corridor to the sea. As long as Athens controlled the sea, it could import food, export goods, and project power across the Aegean. Sparta could march around Attica burning farms, but they couldn't actually defeat Athens unless they could breach the walls or starve the city, and they could do neither. The plan required extraordinary discipline. Athenian farmers would watch from the walls as Spartan soldiers destroyed their olive groves, burned their homes, and trampled their fields. They would have to trust that Pericles' strategy would eventually work, that Sparta would exhaust itself and agree to terms favorable to Athens. In 431 BCE, Sparta invaded Attica. Pericles' plan went into effect. Tens of thousands of people crowded into Athens and the space between the long walls. The city became impossibly overcrowded. People camped in temples, in the spaces between buildings, anywhere they could find shelter. Sanitation deteriorated. Tensions rose. Pericles gave speech after speech, urging patience and confidence. He sent the Athenian fleet to raid Spartan coastal territories, demonstrating that Athens could strike back even while defending at home. He distributed payments to poorer citizens to ease their suffering. He projected absolute certainty that his strategy would succeed. And then, the plague arrived. In 430 BCE, a devastating epidemic struck Athens. The exact disease is still debated: typhus, typhoid, measles, smallpox, or something else. But its effects were catastrophic. The overcrowded conditions inside the walls created perfect conditions for rapid spread. Bodies piled up in the streets. The sick were abandoned by their families out of fear of contagion. Traditional burial rites were ignored. Social order began to break down, as people realized that neither piety, nor wealth, nor virtue could protect them from death. Thucydides, who survived the plague, left a haunting description. Men now coolly ventured on what they had formerly done in a corner. No fear of God or law had a restraining influence. As for the gods, it seemed to be the same thing whether one worshipped them or not when one saw the good and the bad dying indiscriminately. Pericles himself contracted the disease. It killed his sister and both of his legitimate sons from his first marriage. Yet he continued to appear in public, trying to maintain morale and defend his policies. But the Athenians had had enough. For the first time in over a decade, the assembly turned against Pericles. They voted to remove him from his position as strategos. They fined him a substantial sum, somewhere between 15 and 50 talents. The man who had led Athens for a generation, who had made it the greatest city in Greece, was now blamed for the catastrophe that had befallen it. It didn't last. Within months, as conditions failed to improve and alternative leaders proved inadequate, the assembly re-elected Pericles as strategos. But he was a broken man. The plague had weakened him, and grief over his sons' deaths had shattered his usual composure. In one of his final public appearances, Pericles asked the assembly to legitimize his son with Aspasia, also named Pericles, who, under Athenian law, was not a citizen because his mother was foreign. Ironically, this meant asking for an exception to a citizenship law that Pericles himself had sponsored years earlier, which restricted citizenship to those with two Athenian parents. The assembly granted his request, moved by pity for their old leader.
In 429 BCE, Pericles died from complications of the plague. He had lived just long enough to see his strategy beginning to work. Sparta was indeed struggling with the costs of the war,
but not long enough to see Athens ultimately lose everything. The Peloponnesian War would drag on for another 25 years after Pericles' death, ending in 404 BCE with Athens' complete defeat. The empire was dismantled, the long walls were torn down, the democracy was temporarily overthrown. The Golden Age was over. So was Pericles a failure? Did his policies lead Athens to ruin? The answer is complicated. Without Pericles' aggressive imperialism and refusal to compromise with Sparta, Athens might never have fought the war at all. But without his building program, his cultural patronage, and his expansion of democratic participation, Athens would never have become the city that inspired Western civilization. Pericles created a paradox, a democracy built on empire, freedom for citizens paid for by the subjugation of allies. He gave poor Athenians unprecedented political power, while extracting tribute from poorer Greeks elsewhere. He championed free speech and inquiry, while occasionally suppressing those who questioned his policies. He created monuments to civic equality, while living with a foreign woman his critics claimed controlled him. Yet his legacy is undeniable. The Parthenon still stands on the Acropolis, one of the most recognizable buildings in the world. The ideas developed in Periclean Athens, democracy, free enquiry, tragedy, history, philosophy, formed the foundation of Western thought. When America's founders created their own republic, they looked back to Athens for inspiration and warning. When people debate the responsibilities of empire, the relationship between freedom and security, or the role of culture in politics, they're continuing arguments that began in Pericles' assembly. Pericles' funeral oration remains one of the most powerful articulations of democratic values ever written. His vision of a society that values merit over birth, that encourages debate and diversity, that sees citizens as active participants rather than passive subjects, still resonates today. But we should also remember what Athenian democracy excluded. Women had no political rights, slaves had no freedom, and foreign residents had limited legal protections. Pericles' Athens, for all its greatness, was built on fundamental inequalities that we now recognize as incompatible with true democracy. Perhaps that's the most important lesson. Democracy is always a work in progress, always incomplete, always in tension with other values and practical necessities. Pericles created something revolutionary, direct democratic participation on a scale never before attempted. But he couldn't resolve all the contradictions inherent in that system. Neither have we.
Pericles died in 429 BCE, but his Athens lived on in memory and imagination. Not the real Athens with its plagues and wars and hypocrisies, but an idealized Athens, where free citizens gathered to debate ideas, where philosophers questioned everything, where artists created immortal works, where democracy meant government by the people in the most literal sense possible. That idealized Athens has shaped human politics for 2,500 years. It influenced the Roman Republic, inspired the Italian city-states, informed Enlightenment thinkers, and provided a model, however imperfect, for modern democracy. When we invoke Athens, we're usually invoking Pericles' Athens, whether we know it or not. But was Pericles a radical who perfected democracy, as our title claims? Or was he an imperialist who corrupted democracy by making it dependent on exploitation? Was he a far-sighted statesman who elevated Athens to unprecedented heights? Or was he a calculating demagogue who led his city into a disastrous war? The answer, maddeningly, is all of the above. Pericles was brilliant and flawed, visionary and limited, democratic and autocratic. He expanded citizen participation while building an empire.
He championed equality while maintaining privilege. He created cultural treasures while spending the money of subject allies. He talked of peace while preparing for war. In other words, he was human, shaped by his time and context, making choices with incomplete information and competing pressures, trying to balance ideals with realities. And somehow, despite all the contradictions and complications, he helped create something that outlasted empires and tyrants. The idea that ordinary people can govern themselves, that citizens can shape their own destiny, that democracy, for all its flaws, beats every alternative. What do you think? Was Pericles' Athens a golden age or a cautionary tale? Can democracy exist without empire? Can idealism survive contact with reality? Share your thoughts below. And if you're drawn to these stories of leaders who changed history in ways they never fully intended, there are more untold stories waiting in Trueline Files. Because understanding the past is the only way to shape the future.